This clump of trees is the mound we excavated 2 summers ago. It has since grown extensive protective foliage. Very well, this is a shot showing a fire pit. I know you can't find it, but I can. Just label it section of fire pit number 17. These are post moles. The soil proved to be a repository of late woodlands artifacts of surpassing mediocrity, which were joyfully displayed to me chip by chip.
That's the mound we were working on when you came here last year.
Oh, yeah. I recognize him.
We found the foundations of the temple, the God King's temple.
Stone?
No, wood. But very little evidence of people, of
common houses and that sort of thing? Garbage dumps?
Exactly, and very few graves.
Only this year you found the village itself.
If the lake doesn't beat us to it. You see the dark circular areas? Those are where posts were set.
They're post molds.
You've been reading books.
Talking to Cynthia.
This is the men's roundhouse. Walls must have been about yay thick. You can see the fireplace in the middle.
Where's the chimney?
We think there wasn't one. And only one door. Must have been smoky as hell.
So we're standing right in the middle of the village.
Yep. The roundhouse is here. Houses along here and here, surrounding the plaza. Must have been maybe 6 acres, streets along here, fields back here. This is the mound at one end. They had another at the other end that Jasker plowed under about 9 years ago.
They aren't burial mounds.
No, these are a lot later. We've had 3 separate cultures who built mounds. The Adena way back in 600 BC, then the...
BC? 600 BC?
600 BC, then the Hopewell culture, they both built burial mounds. Then along about 700 AD, there moved into the area a whole new idea in mound building. Instead of building the mound over the grave, they built the mound, and then on top of the mound, they built the house for their high muckamuck, the God King. 2 mounds, one for the muckamuck, one for the temple.
One at each end of the village.
We call these people the Temple Mound people, or for short, the early Mississippian culture.
Yes, the population here at its zenith was maybe 6,000.
God, that's a city.
Some of these places were vast. Cahokia in St. Louis was bigger than Paris or London at the time, probably 50, 60,000 people.
What happened to them?
What happened to them? Where did they come from? Where did they bury their God King? Why did they leave?
We'll let you know.
It's more, rural than the spectacular cultures, isn't it?
It was spectacular.
I mean, like the Aztec Empire.
If Cortez had landed here in 1250, you wouldn't even be talking about the Aztecs at all. You'd be talking about the glory that was Jasker's Field. They just didn't leave anyone hanging around to translate the poetry.
The Aztec Empire had poetry?
The Aztec culture was not an empire.
Well, or the Incan culture.
The Incans had an empire.
Oh, well, in any case, they had poetry. What did it sound like?
It sounded like poetry. Free verse, rhyming verse. Think Emily Dickinson. Here are our precious flowers and songs. May our friends delight in them. May the sadness fade out of our hearts. This earth is only lent to us. We shall have to leave our fine work. We shall have to leave our beautiful flowers. That is why I am sad as I sing for the sun.
Who was that?
We don't know his name, Delia. We only know his work.
Oh, yes. Take a good look at this, Diane. If you want, you can have it laminated in plastic and carried about with you. This is the beginning of our work to uncover the burial. See the shaded area in the center pointing straight toward the rising midsummer sun. This is the sort of sight that makes an experienced archaeologist quake in his boots and remember his dreams.
What's up? Hey, I hope y'all doing good, man. Yeah, this gonna be part 3. You know, we getting a viewpoint from Dr. R.S. Clymer, and this is gonna be in the Mystic Americanism or Spiritual Heritage of America Revealed. Again, this from his works, Supreme Grand Master. We got some works in here from Grace Kincaid Maury, member of the Conclave, Knights of Chivalry, the great work. Okay, and this was authorized by Emerson M. Clymer, Director of General Church of Illumination, the Supreme Grand Master of Confederation of Initiates, and the Fortuna Rosicrucius of the 8th Priesthood. This is coming out in 1975. So this is just some of, again, their accounts, and what we're going to be just diving into. A lot of good stuff in relation to the mound builders. But again, just the whole veil of antiquity itself. I think this is really important as we're just going through it all. So like I said, we in this continuing it on in the American ethnology. So we're just going to begin on. And I'll stop and say some stuff here and there. You know how I do. So it may be true that all the Aboriginal peoples found inhabiting North and South America, save the Eskimo, excluding the Eskimo, belonged originally to the same race. Some writers assume it to be true, although it seems strongly improbable, not to say impossible. Okay, some assume it to be true, although it seems strongly improbable, not to say impossible. If they were all of the same race, time and development under different conditions of life had divided this race into at least 2 extremely unlike branches, separate and distinct. The wild Indians of North America were profoundly different from the ancient people of Central America and Peru. So you see now how we have all these different accounts. We're also going to be going into the Alleghanies soon, okay? So deeper into the Alleghanies and different accounts and how they compare the Alleghanies again to the wild Indians, all right? And this is not to downplay anything. This is just to establish an understanding of that there were 2 different types of people within this country, okay? So we say the Pueblo or village Indians of New Mexico have scarcely anything in common with the Apaches, Comanches, and Sioux. Even the uncivilized Indians of South America are different from those in the United States. Our wild Indians have more of a resemblance to the nomadic Koraks. Okay, Koraks. Could that also be Cossacks? No, probably not. And the Chukchis, okay, found in eastern Siberia, throughout the region that extends to Bering's Strait, than to any people on this continent. Those who have seen these Siberians, traveled with them, and lived in their tents have found the resemblance very striking, but I infer from what they say that the Korak or the Chukchi is superior to the Indian. See Kennan's Tent Life in Siberia. Now, Mr. Lewis H. Morgan finds evidence that the American Aborigines had a common origin in what he calls their systems of consanguinity and affinity. If it can be made to appear beyond question that these systems prevail and are identical everywhere from Patagonia to the Arctic zone, his argument will have great force. So we'll come back up here to the footnote. Many of the North American remains of man date back to a time before our great western mountain ranges raised their imposing heads above the level of the plains. That's a big one. That's a big statement. So many of the North American remains of man, so the remains that we digging up, date back to a time before our great western mountain ranges raised their imposing heads above the level of the plains. So before the mountain ranges even came together and made themselves, some of these remains are older than that formation. In our western states, there are traceable 4 civilizations of human dwellings that occupied the land before the cliff dwellers and the present red Indians. Okay, so you telling me now that we got evidence of 4 different ancient civilizations underneath the strata? That's what you're trying to tell me right now? Okay, all right, cool. We're gonna keep going. So he says the Indian nations from the Atlantic to the Rocky Mountains and from the Arctic Sea to the Gulf of Mexico, with the exception of the Eskimo, have the same system. Same system. It is elaborate and complicated in its general form and details. Very elaborate and complicated. They don't understand because it's too far back for them to understand. And while deviations from uniformity occur in the systems of different stocks, the radical features are in the main constant. Okay, so he's thinking we got some consistency here. This identity is essential characteristics of a system so remarkable and tends to show that it must have been transmitted with the blood to each stock from a common original source. Now, from the blood to each stock, to the blood of each stock from a common original source. When I read that, I don't read a common original source as one stock. I'm looking at it transmitted to the blood to each stock, to each and every stock from a common original source, a source that transcends human origin, spirit, incarnate, going into the past or into the unknown and back into existence again, coming back, the cycles. And with those cycles, the understanding of certain things that is still within the Akashic record is then translated into this reality. We know we have multiple realities working here at play. That's how I'm taking that statement. I don't know. How do you take it? Let me know. So, this identity is essential in the essential characteristics of a system so remarkable tends to show that it must have been transmitted with the blood to each stock from a common original source. It affords the strongest evidence yet obtained of unity in origin of the Indian nations within the region defined. But unity in a race among the wild Indians found within the region specified will be sufficiently manifest without this evidence. That the same system of consanguinity and affinity with precisely the same features of identity ever was extended over the whole continent remains unproved at this time. The supposed traces of it among the Pueblos are by no means clear. A more complete and accurate research is required to show that identically the same system ever has existed anywhere between the United States and Patagonia. A system not wholly unlike, though not the same, might grow up anywhere in widely separated tribal communities of barbarous peoples without doing anything more than the tribal system itself to show a common origin and race. The Aborigines of America may have been originally all of the same race. Now he wants to say it up there. He just said, well, I don't know, it's not impossible, but I don't think it's probable. But now you're saying may have been. Come on, pick one. There are some considerations in favor of this hypothesis which have been used by writers entitled to great respect, but it cannot yet be claimed without reason that they have been able to settle this question beyond the reach of doubt, even in their own minds. Therefore, to speak moderately, it would be premature to assume that the Mound Builders were even remotely of the same race with the wild Indians, from whom they were so different in all that we know of them. And so that's where I get confused, as I'm consistently telling each and every one of y'all throughout. Anybody that's doing the research, it's not what they're doing is, and it's not that they don't want to. It's not that they don't want to say that the wild Indians and the ancient Mound Builders or the ancient Huehue Tlapalans or the Atalans and Kutans were not of the same race, but it were from the same stock, but it just don't match up. It's not, they just saying what they know. The attempt to establish this hypothesis of identity and race has given rise to the tendency to underrate the development of the ancient people of Mexico and Central America, and to lower the estimate of their attainments sufficiently to bring them within reach of close relationship to the wild Indians. I'm gonna read that one more time because that is very true. By trying to relate them, one, you're elevating the status of the Mound Builders to the wild Indians, but at the same time, you're really bringing them down by relating them in that state of what they was going through. The barbarous ones, the wild ones. I'm not saying all of them are. We know that they're not, but the wild ones to. You bring it, you see what I'm saying? So I'm going to read it again. The attempt to establish this hypothesis of identity and race has given rise to its tendency to underrate the development of the ancient people of Mexico and Central America, and then to lower the estimate of their attainment sufficiently to bring them within the reach of the close relationship to the wild Indians. So you see now what I'm saying? The difficulty being reduced in this way, there follows an attempt to get rid of it entirely and establish connection between these unlike peoples by talking of semi-village Indians. So now we got, okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to give this hypothesis that they didn't build these great temples and these great civilizations and these great towns and cities. And we're going to relate them now to semi-village Indians to try and bring them up to the aspect of great mound works, okay? But the hypothesis used in this case is not well warranted by facts. Such semi-village Indians, as are supposed, really standing halfway between the savages and the Pueblos and being actually savages, half developed into Pueblos, have never had a clearly defined and unquestionable existence here since the continent became known to certain groups of Europeans. In the border region between the northern wild Indians and the old Mexican race, the old Mex, okay, but not just old Mex, Nahuatl, Chichimex, okay, there are exceptional communities formed by association or mixture, of course, okay, but we cannot reasonably give them the significance claimed for the supposed semi-village Indians. Moreover, these exceptional communities are usually Pueblos, whose habits have been changed and their civilization lessened by association with wild Indians, or in some other way. The Navajos began their present condition by fleeing to the mountains from the Spaniards. Okay? The mound builders, who must have been still more than the Pueblos, unlike the barbarous Indians, cannot be explained by any reference whatever to such communities. If they were of the same race, they were far from being the same people. Some ethnologists whose suggestions are entitled to respect, and you know, this one right here is actually a big statement, because I'm sure there are many people in your family that are nothing like you. They don't believe like you, they don't think like you, they don't operate in the same manner. Their whole structure of everything is completely different. So that statement's kind of aligns with me, because if they were of the same race, if you were of the same family, they were far from being the same people, and that can happen. Okay, so we got to understand that too. We got to check that perspective out. So some ethnologists whose suggestions are entitled to respectful attention, whether accepted or rejected, specify considerations which they believe forbid us to regard the ancient Mexicans and the northern wild Indians as identical in race. They point to a well-known fact that the fauna of the American continent below the northern frontier of Mexico is remarkably different from that between this line and the Arctic Sea. At the north, America abounds in species similar to those of Europe and Asia, with some admixture of forms wholly American, while at the south the old world forms disappear and the fauna of the whole region between Mexico and Cape Horn becomes as peculiar as that of Australia. The explanation given is, doesn't mean it's correct, but the explanation given is that during the glacier period, the larger part of North America, like northern Asia and Europe, was covered with ice and partly submerged, and that the fauna found in this part of North America was introduced after the glacial period by immigration from Asia and Europe over connecting lands or islands at the northwest and the northeast, and perhaps by some migration from the south. The fauna at the south, meanwhile, remaining very much as it was before, with very little change through later migrations from the north. Now, that's why I say the explanation given, because when they talk about that, you know, North America being covered with ice and partly submerged, you know, this is going to come in a lot of factors, and I think my understanding is starting to develop a little bit further, especially diving into Brazier Derboborg's work, and as we're talking about how the gods were volcanoes, okay, and that the dragon is the head and the tail, you know, the head and the tail. The volcano is the head and the tail of the dragon. You cut off the head, the fire comes out. And what's the tail? The magma that flows underneath, okay? Just the same as Medusa aspect. The Medusa of, you know, the many snakes on the head. You see what I'm saying? Turning things into stone. The many snakes were the rivers of lava, magma that flows. You dig what I'm saying? So when we start to speak of a lot of the volcanoes, let's just take a look at something real quick. So what I want you to notice is what you're looking at right now is that this is Crater Lake, and this is in Oregon, okay? What you'll notice down here as well is another formulation of an active volcano right in the middle. But this is actually the deepest lake in all of America. The deepest lake in all of America. This is a caldera. So this was a volcano. This lake is from a huge volcano blast. Huge. Okay? Huge. The deepest lake in all of America. That's number one. Now, if we're looking deeper into it under the U.S. Geological Survey, okay, what we'll notice is that Crater Lake used to be called Mount Mazama, okay? For more than 100 years, scientists have sought to unravel the remarkable story of Crater Lake's formation. Before Crater Lake became into existence, a cluster of volcanoes dominated the landscape. This cluster, called Mount Mazama, for the Portland, Oregon climbing club, the Mazamas, was destroyed during an enormous explosive eruption 7,700 years ago. So 7,700 years ago, this Mount Mazama blew its head completely off. Okay, so much molten rock was expelled that the summit area collapsed during the eruption to form a large volcanic depression or caldera. Subsequent smaller eruptions occurred as water began to fill the eruption to eventually form the deepest lake in the United States. Okay, decades of detailed scientific studies of Mount Mazama and new maps of the floor of the crater lake reveal stunning details of the volcano's eruptive history and identified potential hazards from future eruptions and earthquakes. Okay, so if something this major was to blow, here in Oregon, what kind of catastrophes would that cause? It would cause a bunch of catastrophes, y'all. This is going to cause the earth to cool down for a very long time. That's number one. Okay. Number two, you're going to have so much volcanic ash over the terrain that nothing is going to grow. Okay. Then you got to think about all the lightning storms. You got to think about all the poisonous rain that's coming down, the toxicity of everything. Okay. Now, this would seem to me to be larger than even, let's say, the blast at Mount St. Helens. I mean, look how deep the lake is, right? If we got to really understand and put some things into perspective, and this is only 7,700 years ago. So if this was to happen 7,700 years ago, we got movement occurring all over the place, not just over here in Oregon, but also along the other land masses that are close and nearby. Okay. This is a huge explosion. This is it today, and you can see just how big of an explosion this was, y'all. Okay. So of course we can see here the crater walls tells the story of the Mount Mazama, and you can see that we have lava domes, we have cones still within here. Okay. So what I guess I'm trying to get at here is the aspect that when they talking about was covered with ice and partially submerged, do you know how many floods actually occur when you get volcanoes like this? Because you're not just getting volcanoes, okay? You're not just getting lava. You're not just getting ash. You getting hella electrical storms. You getting flooding of all types, mud floods. This is where our mud floods coming from, okay? You've got earthquakes going crazy. You got fires all over the place, okay? And then the temperature being decreased over time. So now my understanding of the volcanoes is actually coming into play a lot more in relation to the migrations and movements of people, okay? Because this ain't the only volcano. It's like we forgot to understand that these volcanoes is probably what made our people leave, because they were in such awe and fear of the greatness that occurred. You gotta remember, they ain't had no planes to just move around, no helicopters to just move around. So when they seeing this occur and these blasts are hitting them so hard, like they dying from, they can't breathe, like these things are real. This was really happening. And we always trying to account a lot of the things like, well, where did these people go? Where did these people leave to? It could have been as simple as a volcano explosion, y'all, which caused floods, which caused tragedy for a very, very, very long time. All right. But in relation to the fauna aspect of it, I'm not necessarily digging on that as far as migrations and bringing new things. So Professor Huxley called attention to this subject in a brief address to the London Ethnological Society in 1869. After stating the case, he presented the Austro-Columbian fauna, blase, we skipping through that. So then he then suggests that the Eskimo may now represent the immigrant element and the old Mexican and South American race, that which was indigenous, and that the Red Indians of North America may have appeared originally as an admixture of these two races. Okay, so I guess who said this? This is coming from Professor Huxley. So Professor Huxley is saying that the Eskimos mixed in with the original Aborigines of South America and Mexico, and that's what created the Red Indians. Okay, that sounds pretty reasonable. He adds, very reasonably, it is easy to suggest such problems as these, but quite impossible in the present state of our knowledge to solve them. So who were the mound builders? They were unquestionably American Aborigines. So they didn't come from anywhere else. Unquestionably, they were Aborigines here. They originated here. Wherever they come from, whether some say they come from the depths of the caves, out of the ocean, whatever the case may be, they are unquestionably American Aborigines, and not immigrants from another continent. That appears to be the most reasonable suggestion, which assumes that the mound builders came originally from Mexico and Central America, or originally from Huehuetlapalan and then down into Mexico and Central America. It explains many facts connected, but then again, you got to remember that America was originally known, even when the Spaniards came over here, the French, or whoever else you want to say, as Mexico. I'm talking about the majority of all of America was known as Mexico. It explains many facts connected with their remains. In the Great Valley, their most populous settlements were at the south, coming from Mexico and Central America. Okay, so that right there, I think, is a little bit of hijack, because to say that at the south they were the most, we've seen a very large widespread of mounds all throughout. Could those that were some at the south be later additions, right? Later additions towards the end after another great cataclysm came, whether it be volcano, hurricane, any of those things. I think myself personally, I'm starting to back away from the whole deluge globally. And I think these deluges happened locally in relation to volcanoes and earthquakes, mud floods, things of that nature, tsunamis. So coming from Mexico, okay, so it seems evident that they came by this, So it says, in the Great Valley of the most populous settlements were at the south, coming from Mexico and Central America. They would begin their settlements on the Gulf Coast. Probable, but still I'm thinking in the Ohio Valley. And afterward, advance gradually up the river to the Ohio Valley. It seems evident that they came by this route. Some would believe, we know others that think different, and their remains showed that their only connection with the coast was at the south.
Inside these mounds, unusual pottery and ornate artifacts were often found next to human remains of an ancient people that vanished long ago. We now know that mounds and the practice of mound building in North America was more than just a peculiarity, unlike the famous carved stone heads on Easter Island. For over 2,000 years, ancient peoples left their marks throughout the eastern half of the country, referred to as the woodlands. Once the information was collected, it was found that there were hundreds of sites containing thousands of earthworks. Looking at this colossal undertaking in its entirety, it becomes clear that the labors of the North American mound builders were of such magnitude, it makes these structures one of the great accomplishments of early mankind. The Europeans exploring America were understandably curious about the origin of these mounds and the treasures that might be found inside them. And early excavations uncovered an extraordinary amount of beautifully crafted pottery and artifacts. Many showed sophisticated workmanship and were evidence of elaborate trading networks that brought goods from as far off as the Rocky Mountains and the Gulf of Mexico, a distance of more than 1,000 miles. Many of the graves that were unearthed revealed elaborate burial practices. This all seemed too exotic to be indigenous to what people thought of as the New World. When confronted with the question of who built these earthen structures, later inhabitants of North America didn't accept that these finds were the work of ancestral Indians. The finds indicated a more sophisticated culture had once thrived there. Not only did the current lifestyle of the Indians seem unrelated, but the Indians themselves, when asked who was responsible for the mounds, didn't have an answer. Anxious for a solution, Americans at the time came up with other explanations.
The earliest interpretations of the people who built the mounds was that they couldn't have been Native Americans. They had to have been constructed by someone coming in from somewhere else, whether they were lost Welsh tribes or lost children of Israel or Maya from South America or something like that. But in fact, they do appear to be, and there's no evidence to suggest that they're not, purely indigenous. The people who were living here at the time constructed them.
Even the lost continent of Atlantis was included in these lost race theories. The ideas presented not only seemed exciting and magical, but were probably promoted to increase the value of the artifacts being sold as curios by those plundering the mounds for profit. These theories also supported the then racist notion that Indians were not sufficiently civilized or ambitious enough to have been responsible for such feats. When these lost civilization explanations lost credence, there began an almost willful effort to dismiss the mounds as natural geological features formed through unusual forms of erosion. To support this, it was pointed out that America was filled with other spectacular and unique natural landforms. Additionally, most of the mound sites were located on fertile ground, which would have been perfect for farmland. The artifacts being uncovered were often explained as coming from tribes that lived on these natural landforms at different times. Part of the problem, of course, was that the science of archaeology was in its infancy. Other tribes had indeed inhabited the sites both before and after the era of mound construction. But without modern dating techniques and a total understanding of stratigraphy, the confusion is understandable. It's hard to believe how the largest structures in North America, built before 20th century skyscrapers and giant airplane hangars, could ever have been misinterpreted as erosional remnants, even when considering the hundreds of years of weather and vegetation that had obscured them. We now know that western Illinois was once home to America's prehistoric population at a site we call Cahokia.
It was in the 1920s that Warren K. Moorhead, an archaeologist, came here to help the effort for the state to acquire this property. He did this by excavating in the mounds, some places between the mounds, to find objects, pottery, worked shell, flint work, that would demonstrate that these mounds were not only lived upon by Indians, but they were built by Indians, and that these were man-made, these were artificial. In the case of Monk's Mound, it was almost a magic mountain.
Monk's Mound is the largest prehistoric earthwork in the whole Western Hemisphere. Its base covers over 14 acres. It stands 100 feet high and has several terraces. Excavations have revealed that there was a huge building at the top. This construction was over 104 feet long and about 48 feet wide, and would be where a chieftain, the paramount ruler, would have lived and governed his community. It also would have been the setting for ritual and ceremonial activities.
We estimate that there's at least 22 million cubic feet of earth in Monk's Mound. And someone has figured out this would be over 14.5 million basket loads of dirt that were probably carried on the Indians' backs, load after load. So a tremendous expenditure of human labor, time, and material to construct this mound. But it wasn't all done at once. It was done in a series of stages. And from excavations and corings we've done through the mound, we can identify many building stages. So perhaps as a leader would die, they'd burn down or tear down the old building on top, add more dirt, put up a new building for the new leader. So the mound gradually increased in size.
The Atlantic theory. I have already stated in general terms the hypothesis advanced by Brasier de Bourbourg and some other writers. This may be called the Atlantic theory, for it attributes the civilization of ancient America to the Atlantids, or Atlantic race, who occupied the lost island of Atlantis. Brasier de Bourbourg has studied the monuments, writings, and traditions left by this civilization more carefully and thoroughly than any other man living. He has fancies which may be safely rejected, and he has theories which, doubtless, will always lack confirmation. But he has much also which demands respectful consideration. There is a great deal in his books to provoke criticism, Those well acquainted with the antiquities and ancient speech of Egypt may reasonably give way to a smile of incredulity while reading what he says in support of the notion that the great civilization of Egypt also came originally from this Atlantic race. Nevertheless, his volumes are important because they furnish materials which others can use more carefully, and because he has learned to decipher some of the Central American writings and brought to view certain paths of inquiry which others may pursue with a more rigid method. As already stated, his Atlantic theory of an old American civilization is that it was originated on this continent, but on a portion of the continent which is now below the waters of the Atlantic Ocean. It supposes the continent extended anciently from New Granada, Central America, and Mexico in a long irregular peninsula so far across the Atlantic that the Canary, Madeira, and Azores, or Western Islands, may be remains of this portion of it. High mountains stood where we now find the West Indian Islands. Beyond these, toward Africa and Europe, was a great extent of fertile and beautiful land, and here arose the first civilization of mankind, the first, which furnished many ages, until at length this extended portion of the continent was engulfed by tremendous convulsions of nature, volcanoes, or by a succession of such convulsions which made the ruin complete. After the cataclysm, a part of the Atlantic people who escaped destruction settled in Central America, where perhaps their civilization had been previously introduced. The reasons urged in support of this hypothesis make it seem plausible, if not probable, to imaginative minds. In the first place, Brazier de Bourbourg claims that there is in the old Central American books a constant tradition of an immense catastrophe of the character supposed, that this tradition existed everywhere among the people when they first became known to the Europeans, and that recollections of the catastrophe were preserved in some of their festivals, especially in one celebrated in the month of Iscali, which was instituted to commemorate this frightful destruction of land and people, and in which princes and people humbled themselves before the divinity and besought him to withhold the return of such terrible calamities. This tradition affirms that a part of the continent extending into the Atlantic was destroyed in a manner supposed, and appears to indicate that the destruction was accomplished by a succession of frightful conversions. 3 are constantly mentioned, and sometimes there is a mention of 1 or 2 others. The land was shaken by frightful earthquakes, and the waves of the sea combined with volcanic fires to overwhelm and engulf it. Each convulsion swept away portions of the land until the whole disappeared, leaving the line of the coast as it is now. Most of the inhabitants overtaken among their regular employments were destroyed, but some escaped in ships, and some fled for safety to the summits of high mountains, or to portions of the land which, for the time, escaped immediate destruction. Quotations are made from the old books in which this tradition is recorded, which appear to verify his report. We talk about Brazier de Bourbourg, of what is found in them. To criticize intelligently his interpretation of their significance, one needs to have the knowledge of those books and traditions equal at least to his own. You gotta get deep. If you don't, you ain't understand it. In the second place, he appeals to the story of Atlantis, preserved in the annals of Egypt and related to Solon by the priests of Sais. It is stated in Plutarch's Life of Solon that while in Egypt, he conferred with the priests of Xenophis, Sochis, Heliopis, and Sais, and learned from them the story of Atlantis. Yeah, again, 4 priests, just like when we're talking about the 4 priests of Huehuetlapalan. Brazier de Bourbourg cites Cousin's translation of Plato's records of this story as follows, quote, "Among the great deeds of Athens of which recollection is preserved in our books, there is one which should be placed above all others. Our books tell that the Athenians destroyed an army which came across the Atlantic Sea and insolently invaded Europe and Asia. For this sea was then navigable, and beyond the strait where you placed the Pillars of Hercules, there was an island larger than Asia Minor and Libya combined. From this island one could pass easily to the other islands, and from these to the continent which lies around the interior sea. The sea on the side of the strait, the Mediterranean, of which we speak, resembles a harbor with a narrow entrance, but there is a genuine sea, and the land which surrounds it is veritable continent. In the island of Atlantis reigned 3 kings with great and marvelous power. They had under their dominion the whole of Atlantis, several other islands, and some parts of the continent. At one time, their power extended into Libya and into Europe as far as Tyrrhenia, and, uniting their whole force, they sought to destroy our countries at a blow. But their defeat stopped the invasions and gave entire independence to all the countries on this side of the Pillars of Hercules. Afterward, in one day and one fatal night, they came mighty earthquakes and inundations which engulfed that warlike people. Atlantis disappeared beneath the sea, and then that sea became inaccessible, so that navigation on it ceased on account of the quantity of mud which the engulfed island left in its place. This invasion took place many ages before Athens was known as a Greek city. It is referred to an extremely remote antiquity. The festival known as the Lesser Panathenea, which, as symbolic devices used in its show, commemorated this triumph over the Atlantes. It's said to have been instituted by the mythical Eratosthenes in the earliest times remembered by Athenian tradition. Solon had knowledge of the Atlantes before he went to Egypt, but he heard there for the first time this account of their island and of its disappearance in a frightful cataclysm. But Atlantis is mentioned by other ancient writers. An extract preserved in Proclus, taken from a work now lost, which is quoted by Boeck in his commentary on Plato, mentions islands in the exterior sea beyond the Pillars of Hercules, and says it is known that in one of these islands the inhabitants preserved from their ancestors a remembrance of Atlantis, an extremely large island which for a long time held dominion over all the other islands of the Atlantic Ocean. So Brazer de Berberg claims that these traditions on both sides of the Atlantic mean the same thing. The island of Atlantis, larger than Libya and Asia Minor together, was the extended portion of the American continent. These concurring traditions cannot be devoid of historical significance. The constant references by ancient Greek writers to the Atlantes, who are always placed at the extremity of Europe and Africa on the ocean which bears their name, may reasonably be regarded as vague and faded recollections of such a history connected with that ocean as that implied by what was said of their island in the annals of Egypt. In support of his view of what is meant by the traditions, he adds the philological argument, quote, "The words Atlas and Atlantic have no satisfactory etymology in any language known to Europe. They are not Greek, and cannot be referred to any known language of the Old World. But in the Nahuatl language we find immediately the radical atl, which signifies water, war, and the top of the head. Molina vocab en lengua mexicana y castellana, etc. From this comes a series of words such as atlan, on the border of or amid the water, from which we have the adjective Atlantic. We also have atraca, to combat or to be in agony. It means likewise to hurl or dart from the water. And in the preterite makes Atlas. A city named Atlan existed when the continent was discovered by Columbus at the entrance of the Gulf of Araba in Darien, with a good harbor. It is now reduced to an unimportant pueblo named Acla." Unquote. In the third place, he quotes opinions expressed without any regard whatever to his theory to show that scientific men who have considered the question believe that there was formerly a great extension of the land into the Atlantic in the manner supposed. The first quotation is from Marot de Saint-Mary's Description topographique et politique de la parte espagnole en les islands de Saint-Dominique, published in 1796 as follows, quote, "There are those who in examining the map of America do not confine themselves to thinking with the French Pliny that the innumerable islands situated from the mouth of the Orinoco to the Bahama Channel Islands, which include several Grenadines, not always visible in very high tides or great agitations of the sea, should be considered as summits of vast mountains whose bases and sides are covered with water. But who go farther and suppose these islands to be the tops of the most elevated of a chain of mountains whose bases and sides are covered with water? But who go further and suppose these islands to be the tops of the most elevated of a chain of mountains which crowned a portion of the continent whose submersion has produced the Gulf of Mexico? But to sustain this opinion, it must be added that another vast surface of land, which united the islands of this archipelago to the continent, from Yucatan to the mouth of the Orinoco, was submerged in the same way, and also a third surface which connected them with the peninsula of Florida, and with whatever land may have constituted the northern termination, for we cannot imagine that these mountains whose summits appear above the water stood on the terminating line of the continent." Unquote. He quotes also another authority which cannot be suspected, namely M. Charles Martins, who said in the Revue des Deux Mondes for March 1st, 1867, quote, "Now, hydrography, geology, and botany agree in teaching us that the Azores, the Canaries, and the Madeira are the remains of a great continent which formerly united Europe to North America." Unquote. He could have added other quotations in the same strain. Those geologists who believe that our continents have long remained in nearly the same relative position would probably give the supposed change a much greater antiquity than Brazier de Berberg would be likely to accept, and the geological uniformitarians would deny with emphasis that so great a change in the shape of the continent was ever effected by such means, or with such rapidity as he supposes. But the latest and most advanced school of the geological speculation does not include catastrophism, and therefore will not deny possibility of sudden and great changes by this method. Doubtless, the antiquity of the human race is much greater than is usually assumed by those whose views of the past are still regulated by medieval systems of chronology. Ooh, bow, 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 bow. Archaeology and linguistic science, not to speak here of geology, make it certain that the period between the beginning of the human race and the birth of Christ would be more accurately stated if the centuries counted in the longest estimate of the rabbinical chronologies should be changed to millenniums. And they present also another fact, namely that the antiquity of civilization is very great, and suggest that in remote ages it may have existed with important development in regions of the earth now described as barbarous, and even as Brazier de Berberg supposes, on ancient continents or portions of continents now out of sight below the surface of the oceans. The representation of some speculators that the condition of the human race since its first appearance on the earth has been a condition of universal and hopeless savagery down to a comparatively modern date is an assumption, merely an unwarranted assumption, used in support of an unproved and unprovable theory of man's origin. Its use in the name of science by advocates of this theory, like the theory itself, shows that the constructive power of fancy and imagination will sometimes supersede everything else, and substitute its ingenious constructions for legitimate conclusions, even in scientific speculation. We may claim reasonably that Brazier de Berberg's Atlantic theory is not proved, and on this ground refuse to accept it. I don't. No one is under obligation to attempt disproving it, because it's going to be pretty hard to. But it may, in some cases, win supporters by enlisting in its favor all the forces of imagination to which it appeals to seductive plausibility. Now, is this maybe possibly because you're not understanding everything that he putting forth? Or that possibly you didn't even be able to go through the four letters? We don't know, but these are good opinions. Either way, it will be rejected without much regard to what can be said in its favor, for it interferes with current unreasoning beliefs concerning antiquity and ancient history, and must encounter vehement contradiction from habits of thought fixed by these beliefs. True, some of the stock views of antiquity, by which it will be earnestly opposed, are themselves far more destitute of foundation in either fact or reason, but this will make no difference, as the habit of never allowing them to be subjected to the searching power of reason does not permit such persons either to believe or deny anything connected to the topic in a reasonable manner. Some of the uses made of this theory cannot endure criticism. For instance, when he makes it the basis of an assumption that all civilizations of the old world went originally from America, and claims particularly that the supposed Atlantic race created Egypt, he goes quite beyond reach of the considerations used to give his hypothesis a certain air of probability. You gotta love it. See, they can't see, they always see it in reverse. It's so hard, but I'm even tripped out that R.S. Clymer saying this. It seems as though Brazier de Berberg was on something and they pushed him out. They said, hey man, move around, bro. So, continuing on. Consider then that elevated and terraced foundations for important buildings are peculiar to the ancient Mexicans and Central Americans, that this method of construction, which with them was the rule, is found nowhere else, save that terraced elevations, carefully constructed and precisely like theirs in form and appearance, occupy a chief place among the remaining works of the mound builders. The use made of these foundations at Palenque, Uxmal, and Chichen Itza shows the purpose for which they were constructed in the Mississippi Valley. The resemblance is not due to chance. The explanation appears to me very manifest. This method of construction was brought to the Mississippi Valley from Mexico and Central America. Or could it be the other way around, and the ancient inhabitants of that region and the mound builders being the same people in race and also in civilization when it was brought there? Again, could it be possibly in reverse? You see what I'm saying? And they don't want to explain that. Sometimes people be holding off, especially these secret society ass people. A very large portion of the old structures in Ohio and further south called mounds, namely those which are low in proportion to the horizontal extent, are terraced foundations for buildings. And if they were situated in Yucatan, Guatemala, and southern Mexico, they would never be mistaken for anything else. The high mounds also in the two regions are remarkably alike. In both cases, they are pyramidal in shape and have level summits of considerable extent, which were reached by means of stairways on the outside. We just spoke about that. They just touched bases that DeSoto riding that bad boy up the damn side. The great mound at Chichen Itza is 75 feet high and has on its summit a ruined stone edifice that at Uxmal is 60 feet high and has a similar ruin on its summit that at Mayapan is 60 feet high. The edifice placed on its summit has disappeared. The great mound at Miamisburg, Ohio is 68 feet high, and that of Grave Creek, West Virginia is 75 feet high, where they found Grave Creek. I showed it on this. You see all the Hebrew writing? Both had level summits and stairways on the outside, but no trace of any structure remains on them. All these mounds were constructed for religious uses, and they are in their way as much alike as any 5 Gothic churches. The fact that the settlements and works of the mound builders extended through Texas and across the Rio Grande indicates very plainly their connection with the people of Mexico and goes far to explain their origin. We have other evidence of intercourse between the two peoples, for the obsidian dug from the mounds, and perhaps the porphyry also, can be explained only by supposing commercial relations between them. We cannot suppose the mound builders to have come from any other part of North America, for nowhere else north of the isthmus was there any other people capable of producing such works as they left in the places where they dwelt. Beyond the relics of the mound builders themselves, no traces of the former existence of such a people have been discovered in any part of North America save Mexico and Central America and districts immediately connected with them. At the same time, it is not reasonable to suppose the civilized people of the regions extended their settlements through Texas and also migrated across the Gulf into the Mississippi Valley. In fact, the connection of settlements by way of Texas, Sylvanus, appears to have been unbroken from Ohio to Mexico. This colonizing extension of the old Mexican race must have taken place at a remote period in the past, for what has been said of the antiquity of the mound builders show that a very long period, far more than 2,000 years, it may be, must have elapsed since they left the valley of the Ohio. Perhaps they found the country mostly unoccupied and saw there but little of any other people until an eruption of warlike barbarians came upon them from the northwest, the Ocuzians. In speculating on the causes of their withdrawal after the centuries of occupation, absolutely certainty is impossible, and we must by no means of going much beyond mere conjecture, unless we go into the aspect of volcanoes, right? You ever heard of the ash veil of, I think it's 52 AD? Or 552 AD? I think it's 52 though. Huge ash all over the world, okay, from volcanic explosions. So I don't understand why we don't talk about that. So that's why, in speculating, okay, we may suppose as most probable that an influx of barbarians destroyed their border settlements, interrupted their mining operations, and caused them to retire gradually toward the Gulf. Me and my aspect, I'm starting to see it as just natural catastrophes. It might just be that. Fragments of their communities may have become incorporated with the barbarous tribes, Why wouldn't they? This conjecture, and when you kind of think of it too, these aspects of people just saying, oh, these barbarous tribes came down, like they try to put certain people in a light like that because they have prejudices against them. So you got to kind of think of it at all angles, especially if it's speculation. Don't just tie down to one thing. You see what I'm saying? Just put it all out there. So fragments of their communities may have been incorporated with the barbarous tribes. This conjecture has been used to explain certain exceptional peculiarities noticed in some of the wild Indian tribes. For instance, it has been suggested that the Mandan Indians were a separate and lost fragment of the mound-building people, they being noticeably unlike other Indians in many respects, lighter in color and peculiar in manners and customs. Lighter in color? What does that mean? They a little ruddy? They a little olive? They not so swarthy? Okay? And peculiar in manners and customs. What is conjectured may be true, but we have no means of proving its truth. That the Mandans were like what a lost community of mound builders might have become by degeneration through mixture and association with barbarians may be supposed, but the actual history of that remarkable tribe might give its peculiarities in a very different explanation. The Mandans were supposed to be a branch of the Dakotas. They may have been like the Navajos, a changed community of pueblos, but any attempt to explain them by means of conjecture is useless. The supposition that the Toltecs and the mound builders were the same people seems, to me, not improbable. Now we learning a lot from Brazier de Berberg about the aspects of the Toltecans, right? So we got to kind of watch out what's going on all the way there too. Like there's more to the subject, I feel like, and I think we just got to really pay attention to everything, not just getting tied into too much of the conjecture, but really just staying focused on trying to nail down exactly what's going down, right? Getting detailed, trying to stay away from so much conjecture. But these are good explanations of mound builders as well. Now, the reasons it will be stated when we come to a discussion of the antiquities, books, and traditions of Central America. I will only say that here that, according to dates given in the Central American books, the Toltecs came from Huehue Tlapalan, a distant country to the northeast, long previous to the Christian era. They played a great part and had a long career in Mexico previous to the rise of their successors and powers, the Aztecs, who were overthrown by the Spaniards. Thank you. Ruins and other vestiges revealing an ancient civilization are found throughout the whole southern section of North America, extending as far north as New Mexico and Arizona. But here the antiquities do not belong to the same period in the past, nor exhibit unwavering likeness and unity of civilized life. They are somewhat less homogeneous and do not constantly represent the same degree of civilization. In this region, the monuments suggest successive and varying periods in the civilized condition of the old inhabitants. Some of the oldest and most mysterious monuments seeming to indicate the highest development. And in the northern part of this region, we found ruins of great buildings similar in plan and arrangement to those still used by the Pueblos, but far superior as monuments of architecture, science, and skill, and much more unlike those farther south than is apparent in the principal structures of the mound builders. They show that the old settlers in the Mississippi Valley did not belong to the Pueblo branch of the Mexican race. Farther south, in the central part of the region, specified development was more advanced. Here, in the last ages of American ancient history, was the seat of the Mexican or Aztec civilization, but the monuments in this part of the country are mostly older than the Aztec period. The oldest of civilizations. Some investigators who have given much study to the antiquities, traditions, old books, and probable geological history of Mexico and Central America believe that the first civilization the world ever saw appeared in this part of ancient America, or was immediately connected with it. America is the true old world. They hold that the human race first rose to civilized life in America, which was geologically the oldest of the continents, and that, ages ago, the portion of this continent on which the first civilizers appeared was sunk beneath the waters of the Atlantic Ocean, usually the engulfing of this portion of land is supposed to have been affected by some tremendous convulsion of nature, and there is appeal to recollections of such a catastrophe. said to have been preserved in the old books of Central America, and also in those of Egypt, from which Solon received an account of the lost Atlantis. According to this hypothesis, the American continent formerly extended from Mexico, Central America, and New Granada far into the Atlantic Ocean toward Europe and Africa, covering all the space now occupied by the Caribbean Sea, the Gulf of Mexico, and the West India Islands, and going far beyond them toward the east and northeast. This lost portion of the continent was the Atlantis, of which the old annals of Egypt told so much in the time of Solon, as we learn from Plato. And it was the original seat of the first human civilization, which, after the Great Cataclysm, was renewed and perpetuated in the region where we now trace the mysterious remains of ancient cities. Those desiring to know what can be said in support of this view of the ancient America must read the later volumes of Prazer de Bourg, especially his Quatre Lettres sur la Mexique and his Sources de la Historia Primitive de Mexico, etc. And this is where I got the aspect of translating the 4 letters of Mexico that we're going through right now. We refer to it here on account of a very great antiquity it claims for the ancient American civilization. It represents that the advanced human development whose crumbling monuments are studied at Copan, Mitla, and Palenque antedates everything else in the human period of our realm, excepting perhaps an earlier time of barbarism and pastoral simplicity, that its history goes back through all of the misty ages of prehistoric time to an unknown date previous to the beginning of such civilization in any part of the old world. Now, it is said more or less clearly by more than one Greek writer that the Phoenicians and the Carthaginians knew the way to a continent beyond the Atlantic. One fact preserved in the annals of Tyrian commerce and mentioned by several ancient writers is related by Diodorus Siculus very particularly as a matter of authentic history. His narration begins with the following statement, quote, "Over against Africa lies a very great island in the vast ocean, many days' sail from Libya westward. The soil there is very fruitful, a great part whereof is mountainous, but much likewise champaign, which is the most sweet and pleasant part, for it is watered by several navigable streams, and beautiful with many gardens of pleasure planted, and diverse sort of trees, and an abundance of orchards. The towns are adorned with stately buildings and banqueting houses, pleasantly situated in their gardens and orchards," unquote. The great ruins in Yucatan and elsewhere in Mexico and Central America bear witness that there was, anciently, such a country as this, across the ocean, many days' sail from Libya westward. But Diodorus Siculus lived before the Christian era, and how was this known to him and others more than 1,500 years before America was discovered by Columbus? Really, it's Zarco, but Columbus. He tells us as follows, quote, "The Phoenicians, Tyrians, having found out the coast beyond the Pillars of Hercules, sailed along the coast of Africa. One of their ships on a sudden was driven by a furious storm far off into the main ocean. After they had lain under this violent tempest many days, they at length arrived at this island." Now, this undersigned voyage of the Tyrian ships seems to have been made previous to the building of Gadir or Gades. Perhaps they made other voyages to that region, but it was a custom of the Phoenicians to be very secret in regards to the methods and paths of their commerce. A complete history of their commerce and navigation from the earliest times would unquestionably give us views of the past quite as startling to the prevalent, assuming unreasoning habits of belief, or rather disbelief, concerning antiquity, as that hypothesis of Atlantis and the earliest civilization. What is told by Diodorus authorizes us to suppose that the Tyrians, who went across the Atlantic as described, beheld some of the ancient American cities, which are now found in ruins, for it is certain that nothing of this kind existed anywhere else, many days' sail from Libya, northern Africa, westward. Their voyage was made more than 1,100 years previous to the Christian era. If the old Central American books may be trusted, this was not very long previous to the beginning of the Toltec domination. And again, we're going through what the Toltec means, y'all, in Brazier's book. So y'all stay tuned as we're going through the origins of civilization. Now, how long had Palenque been in existence when that Titan ship was driven across the Atlantic? How long had the region been a region of cities and civilization? There is no history which can answer these questions, or can they? Various theories, some of them very wild and irrational, have been advanced to explain the origin of what is seen in these relics of ancient America. Now watch what he says, because he's saying fantastical, irrational, because some of them they don't want you to believe, because it's that simple. You see what I'm saying? If it had been the fashion to explore and study them as their importance deserves, as Egypt and Nineveh had been explored and studied, our knowledge of them would now be much more extensive and valuable, and it might be possible to go farther toward a solution of the problem they present. Okay, so some of the more intelligent investigators have maintained with no little confidence that this ancient American civilization came originally from the Phoenicians. Dodge the hijack, bro. You gotta watch them. You see how they get off on you already, Red? You gotta watch them, bro. Okay. But even so, we're going to keep going. Among those who use reason in their inquiries sufficiently to be incapable of accepting the absurdities of monkish fancy, these hypotheses have been found more favor than any other. I thought they were aboriginal to the place. Wherever inquiry begins by assuming that the original civilizers came from some other part of the world, it seems more reasonable than any other, for more can be said to give the appearance of probability. Seeing in reverse. But let's keep it going. The people known to us as Phoenicians were preeminent as the colonizing navigators of antiquity. They were an enlightened and enterprising maritime people whose commerce traversed every known sea and extended its operations beyond the Pillars of Hercules into the greater exterior ocean. Now, the early Greeks called them Ethiopians. So who were the Phoenicians? Ethiopians, not meaning either black men or Africans. Alright, Clymer, what's your deal, bro? Who wrote this, man? They already know what's up. You know what Ethiopians means, man. Quit playing. And said they went everywhere, establishing their colonies and their commerce in all the coast regions. From this people are in the distant past, far beyond the beginning of what we call history. See? History has knowledge only of a few of their later communities, the Sabians of southern Arabia, the Phoenicians, meaning chiefly the Tyrians and the Carthaginians, but also the Ethiopians. So let's get it right. In that, we talking about the Etruscans. We talking about also, what else we talking about in that bad boy? The Pelasgians. Okay, so all that's under Phoenicians, which would then be under Ethiopians, which would then be under Hamites. What a change there would be in the prevalent conceptions of the past if we could have a complete record of this race from the beginning of its development. It is not difficult to believe that communities of the Phoenician or Ethiopian race were established all around the Mediterranean, even beyond the Strait of Gibraltar, in ages quite as old as Egypt or Chaldea, and that they had communication with America before Tyre or Sidon was built. Why did the ancients say so much of a great Saturnian continent beyond the Atlantic if nobody in the prehistoric ages had ever seen that continent? It was there, as they said, as we know. But whence came their knowledge of it, and such knowledge as led them to describe it as larger than Asia, meaning Asia Minor, Europe and Libya together? This ancient belief must have been due to Phoenician or Ethiopian communication with America in earlier times, which was imperfectly recollected, or perhaps never completely revealed to other nations. And this must have taken place at a very remote period, for imperfect recollection of the great continent across the Atlantic, including what Solon heard in Egypt of Atlantis, was more ancient than the constrained voyage of that Tyrian ship of Diodorus Siculus gives an account. It can be seen that the early Greeks had better knowledge even of the Western Europe than those of later times. A dark age, so far as relates to geographical knowledge, set in upon the countries around the Aegean Sea and on the coast of Asia Minor, after the independence and enterprise of Tyre and other Phoenician cities were destroyed by the Assyrians toward the close of the 9th century before Christ, which was to serve some 450 or 500 years later than the conquest of Alexander the Great. So, the known enterprise of the Phoenician race, Ethiopians, And this ancient knowledge of America, so variously expressed, strongly encouraged the hypothesis that the people called Phoenicians came to this continent and established colonies in the region where ruined cities are found. Watch it, dodge the hijack, and filled it with civilized life. Dodge the hijack. Came with, helped flourish and develop, maybe mixed in. Yeah, but just to say that they took over what they found there that were ruined cities already, I don't know. It is argued that they made voyages on the great exterior ocean, and that such navigators must have crossed the Atlantic, and it is added that symbolic devices similar to those of the Phoenicians are found in the American ruins, and that an old tradition, very old tradition of the Native Mexicans and Central Americans describe the first civilizers as bearded white men who came from the east in ships. Therefore, it is urged the people described in the native books and traditions as Colhuas must have been Phoenicians. It's just so funny to me. You're going to sit here and say bearded white men for everything. It's Quetzalcoatl. Anybody who brings some intelligent knowledge, it's always bearded white men. But you're saying the Phoenicians is Ethiopians. Okay. But if it were true that the civilization found in Mexico, if it were true in Central America, came from the people of the Phoenician race, it would be true also that they built in America as they never built anywhere else. Oh, watch out. That they established a language here radically unlike their own. And that they used a style of writing totally different from that which they carried into every other region occupied by their colonies. Good points there. All the forms of alphabetical writing used at present in Europe and Southwestern Asia came directly or indirectly from that anciently invented by the race to which the Phoenicians belonged, and they have traces of a common relationship which can be easily detected. Now, the writing of the inscriptions at Palenque, Copan, and elsewhere in the ruins has no more relatedness to the Phoenician than to the Chinese writing. It has not a single characteristic that can be called Phoenician any more than the language of the inscriptions or the style architecture with which it can be associated. Dodge the hijack. If I'm not mistaken, we went over that with Curran Mayo in relation to the Old Block Hebrew being Phoenician text. Gonna have to check into that some more. Therefore, we cannot reasonably suppose that this American civilization was originated by the people of the Phoenician race. Whatever may be thought relative to the supposed ancient communication between the two continents and its probable influence on civilized communities already existing here. Boom. Bag 'em up.